Incubated cities are destined to self-destruct. Ruins are the style of our future cities. Future cities are themselves ruins. Our contemporary cities, for this reason, are destined to live only a fleeting moment, give up their energy, and return to inert material. All of our proposals and efforts will be buried, and once again, the incubation mechanism is reconstituted. That will be the future. In 1965, the Japanese architect Kenzo Tange designed city walls and city gates, a master plan to rebuild Yugoslav Skopje after the devastating earthquake of 1963, which killed thousands and destroyed most of the city. Tange would become a leading figure of the Japanese Metabolist movement in architecture, giving shape to the Japanese imperialist imagination, designing housing projects for Japanese settlers across the plains of Manchuria. For Tange and his partner, Arata Sozaki, with whom he collaborated in reimagining post-earthquake Skopje, the Skopje master plan was a purist metabolist project. Catastrophes, fires, earthquakes, and atomic bombs delivered the ideal preconditions, the tabula rasa upon which the mega-cities of the future would be built. Isozaki showed great admiration for the Yugoslav authorities, who packed the homeless population into provisional tents in the suburbs and only began reconstruction after receiving the master plan, which he and Tange designed. The project proved impossible. In reimagining Skopje as a modern city, the differences between Japanese, Yugoslav, and Greek urban planners, supervised by a team from Warsaw, were too huge to be reconciled. The architects tore up their drawings, discarded their models, and returned home. The city walls were eventually built, the city gates not. After Skopje, the project that would bring him international recognition, Tange went on to design, with Louis Kahn, the Teheran that was never built because of the Islamic Revolution. Japanese imperialist imagery found its ways to the non-aligned and decolonizing world, from Nigeria to Pakistan. Skopje was no exception. The metabolist techno-utopia of building megacities up in the air and on the water, along with decolonization, never materialized. Like dreams, they were deemed impossible. In 17th century Ottoman Skopje, the young Asiye Hatun recorded her dreams. A female seeker of the Helvetia order, Hatun had chosen an Islamic mystical path to enlightenment, claiming to have reached spiritual awakening in her dreams. Unsettling standard practices and raising doubts among fellow seekers, Hatun was more concerned with the act of awakening rather than the process itself. Seeking advice on zikr, the meditative recitation of the various names of Allah from experienced sheikhs, Hatun was determined to reach the highest level of mystical awareness. A long epistolary between the disciple and her various masters is a testimony to her arrival at the stage and bears witness to a Muslim woman's liberation in 17th century Skopje. In one of the letters to her spiritual guide, she notes, "I was amazed that Medina was so far away, yet so close. At this point I was told, this road is the back road to Medina. The other will take 6 months, but Allah Ta'ala gave you this back way. It is possible to go as many times as you want." Responding to concerns raised in her letter, he advises her that testimony comes from all angles, warning her that seekers must be diligent, that the porous boundaries in dreams between the shaitan and truth are guarded by the prophet. If you have seen the messenger in your dreams, you have seen truth. In late socialist Yugoslavia, internal debates within federal republics used Skopje's earthquake as a frame of reference for lodging injury and claims of inequality. Two Bosnian communist politicians, Osman Karabegović and Avdo Humo, compared the 1969 earthquake in Krajina, Bosnia, to the Skopje earthquake of 1963. The two disasters were similar in scope and should therefore have received similar treatment from the federal government, they argued, which they had not. In 1972, both Karabegović and Humo would be discharged from the Yugoslav Communist Party under the charges of Muslim exclusivism. The irony of this comparison coming from Bosnia, underlining Muslim grievances for discrimination in socialist Yugoslavia, is that the Muslim populations of Skopje, particularly Roma and Albanians, were equally disfavored during the post-earthquake rebuilding of Skopje. Anticipating the future violent dissolution of the Yugoslav Federation, they denounce a lack of solidarity and rampant inequality between the republics, which ran along ethnic and religious lines. In the years preceding the earthquake of 1963, Skopje became a central hub for Muslim migrants from all over Yugoslavia on their way to Turkey. The Skopje train station became a site of displacement of destitute communities for whom the Yugoslav socialist dream had offered little hope and redemption from the previous kingdom of Yugoslavia. They reached Turkey with the Paris-Istanbul Orient Express and came to be known as Acılı Kuşak, the sorrowful generation. In confidential reports, the migration movement is regarded as a choice of minority members to leave as they wish, while also noting that their departure would appease the resistance encountered from Muslim minorities in building socialism. The lifestyles of Muslims, termed the most backward populations, were thought incompatible with the modern socialist project. Laws prohibiting the wearing of headscarves, measures against Quranic schools, and unauthorized medical treatments, such as circumcision, mark the bodies of those who brought shame to building socialism. In the TV series Trsvia Skopje that ran for 3 years, from 1987 till 1990, the remaining Roma and the Albanian communities of Macedonia are depicted as human traffickers who transport children from Skopje to Trieste, Italy, to bag and steal. This racial marker, inscribed into Roma and Albanian communities as human and drug traffickers, became a potent propaganda tool used against their struggles for equality. Serb and Macedonian late socialist nationalists argued that they weren't targeting Roma and Albanian communities, but human and drug traffickers, a racial euphemism that has now gained a new respectability in the counter-human trafficking tropes of the European Union security apparatus. The socialist complicity in the post-socialist production of space through racialization is rarely questioned. In Suck My Nation, Masculinity, Ethnicity, and the Politics of Homosex, Sasho Lambevsky illustrates the nationalist imperatives that order Macedonian and Albanian gay men to use each other's penises and orifices as weapons and targets of torture. Lambevsky writes, "It was a cold November evening in 1995 in Skopje, and I was on my way from the ethnically mixed suburb of Cento, where my parents live, to the center of the city. Everyone on the bus seemed to be so tense. I could not stop wondering about the moment when the illusion of civic normalcy, the pact of non-aggression between Macedonians and Albanians, between rich and poor, would shatter into Bosnian pieces. I got out of the bus stop in front of the Macedonian Academy of Arts and Sciences, just opposite one of the busiest gay cruising spots in the Macedonian capital, called derogatorily by Macedonian gays, the Selska, the peasants' terminus. The majority of activities in this cruising area happen in and around one of the main Skopje urban transport bus interchanges. All buses arrive and depart from here to the outskirts of the capital or the villages surrounding the capital. Its spatial position and its not completely urbanized ugliness reminds Macedonians of their rural past, and as such, it bears many symbolic meanings for both straight and gay Macedonians. This is a marginal, dark place, sandwiched between national institutions, where jobless hustlers mix with the Macedonian nouveau riches, where plumbers bump into public servants, and where students meet their teachers. I was chatting to some friends at the bus stop until a breathtakingly handsome man in his mid-20s entered my field of vision. I was taken by this man's beauty. Tall, with long dark hair, broad shoulders, and narrow waist, with a slightly cocky walk and a noble face, this man alerted us to our desire. I started trembling silently in anticipation of numerous possibilities of enjoyment. The man glanced at me, cheekily giving me a signal that the next move was mine. However, At the very moment my eyes met his, I turned my gaze, filled with guilt, sorrow, frustration, and incomprehensible anger, away from him. In a fleeting moment, I understood that this could not happen, must not happen, because the man was Albanian. Although I had never seen or talked to this man before, I knew immediately that he was Albanian. It took only a few seconds to read his haircut, his dress, his bodily gestures, and his walk as signs of his albanicity. As soon as I was able to symbolize this man as an Albanian, I felt paralyzed. In a flash, I felt the mobilization of something within my body, ordering me to stick to my Macedonian gender, sexual, ethnic script. I obeyed by putting the discursive mask of my Macedonicity over my body. As soon as I recognized an Albanian, I assumed the role of a good Macedonian. I denied myself the thought of satisfying my desire for this other. I projected onto him the forfeit of my desire as soon as he realized that I was a Macedonian, and therefore cast in the role of a Macedonian bottom, as written in the sex script of the gay scene in Skopje, but not in my desire. The recent top-down efforts to spatially restructure the city using public funds, the Skopje 2014 project, took less than 5 years to complete. Over 130 objects, public buildings, theaters, national archives, museums, courts, bridges, and other state institutions were clothed in neo-Baroque and neoclassicist styles, reminiscent of 18th and 19th century European architectural fantasies of antiquity. They tied Macedonia to past that never existed. Those who are critiquing Skopje's newest face see the 1965 socialist modernist reconstruction of the city as authentic and the 2014 reconstruction as a post-socialist disaster. In a symbolic hug to prevent the mutilation of the city shopping mall, designed by the Macedonian architect Živko Popovski based on Tange's vision, protesters sought to preserve what they saw as the last remainders of socialist Skopje. They also lodged their grievances on the vast surveillance scandals ordered from the same government that built Skopje 2014. In seeking to expose class and gender divisions, the major critique to Skopje 2014 flattens out the difference between dominant and dominated groups. It points fingers at economic inequality perpetuated by laced capitalist development without questioning the racialized hierarchies of populations designated as disposable. Skopje, the apartheid city that is camouflaged as a post-socialist disaster. The Japanese metabolists were convinced that buildings could survive socially only for the duration of a generation, up to 30 years, upon which they would become obsolete. They even suggested to install dynamites inside buildings, which would go off and self-destruct after 30 years to make space for the new, budding and becoming, with love, on fragments from the past. The Iranian Revolution unsettled Cold War alliances, particularly those between the Second and the Third World. For Muslims in Yugoslavia, committed to socialist non-aligned solidarities, the revolution offered an alternative reading of Islam and the emancipatory struggle for justice. For some, the revolution was personal. Richard Kafka was shocked at the sight of the precocious 12-year-old Amir, linking his last name to the famed writer. Amir had rushed to translate for the 1984 Sarajevo Olympics visitor on the tram as the only passenger who understood English. Thanking Amir for his help, Kafka asked the little Sarayli about the parade in the center of the city. It was the first time I learned the word birthday in English, remembers Amir, as he had struggled to explain to the American visitor that every year, on Tito's birthday, Yugoslav youth passed a torch through Yugoslav cities, towns, and villages, on its way to Belgrade, symbolically celebrating the commitment to the future of socialism. Baffled by the 12 years old, Richard Kafka could have never guessed Amir's Kafkaesque nightmare. It had been almost a year that his mother had been sentenced to 5 years in prison. The accused Melika Salihbeg, Father Haki and Mother Najia Neprohic, born in January 1945 in Sarajevo, Muslim, citizen of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, author, divorced mother of a 12-year-old child, literate, elementary and secondary school education, graduate of the Faculty of Political Sciences in Zagreb, owns no property, no prior convictions, permanently residing in Sarajevo. The Sarajevo process of 1983 would convict Melika of betrayal of his socialist ideals under Articles 114 and 136 of the Criminal Code of Yugoslavia. Her counter-revolutionary activities, argued the Sarajevo District Court, had sought to subvert the socialist order under the influence of the Iranian Revolution. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 and its critique of colonialism resonated deeply with the rest of the Muslim world. It had incited the imagination of Melika too. Bringing forth a new language, Ali Shariati, the spiritual leader of the revolution, anchored his anti-colonial resistance on Islam, unearthing the history of Shiism through Imam Hussein's martyrdom at the Battle of Karbala. Melika was introduced to Iranian decolonial praxis in Paris of the early 70s, where she pursued her doctoral studies on temporality and Paul Klee's work. In Paris, she grew close to Iranian revolutionaries and exiles who exposed her to Islamic liberation theology and to the decolonial critique of the continuation of colonial regimes through former decolonization. She was familiarized with the Eurocentric binary rhetoric of communism versus liberalism, of secularism versus religion, where Europe figured always as a universal and non-European thought as a particular. On March 24, 1983, at 5:30 a.m., the bell rang at the apartment on Albanska Street No. 1. I thought it was the poet Abdullah Sidran, recalls Amir, as he had a tendency to come over around that time. Drunk as he was from nights out, he would ring and come over to crash at our place. It was not Sidran. After 5 hours of raiding the apartment, Yugoslav Secret Service agents in civilian clothes arrested his mother and told Amir to lock the door and not to contact anyone. I never slept after that night. At the police station, Melika would be questioned for 40 hours nonstop. On the following night, she was taken to the Sarajevo Central Prison. At her request that she be allowed to see her son, she was told to be satisfied with her condition, as in your Muslim countries, political prisoners are executed. In a semi-public trial, prosecutors presented a letter Melika had written to Ayatollah Khomeini as essential proof of her guilt. For 37 years, she wrote, I have been living in a Christian environment in atheistic Europe, in an environment where a handful of frightened Muslims live, surrounded by an atmosphere of lies and hypocrisy. It is therefore not surprising that my youth, as well the youth of thousands of my compatriots, has been spent in wandering aimlessly down the paths of ignorance. It is no wonder that we are returning to Allah. The more submissive we are, the greater our desperation. The state security services provided the court with intercepted conversations. Melika claimed the apparatchiks was recorded saying that the state-sanctioned Islamic organizations did not work for the benefit of the Muslims and Islam, but instead they did what the authorities ordered them to do, that the Rais ul Ulema, the head of the Muslim communities of Yugoslavia, was controlled by the authorities, that Muslims were unequal in status compared to Serbs, that there was no freedom of writing in Bosnia, that authorities did not allow religious freedoms, and that believers did not enjoy equality with atheists. The establishment of the non-aligned movement in Belgrade in September 1961 had given voice to the hopes and dreams of billions of recently decolonized people to participate in generating new solidarities of the subaltern worlds. Between 1955 and 1979, the non-aligned movement grew from 25 to 117 member countries. It allowed Muslims from Yugoslavia to communicate extensively with Muslims throughout non-aligned countries, participating in a previously unimagined exchange of ideas. Syrian, Iraqi, and Palestinian students studied in Yugoslav universities, while Bosnians, Macedonians, and Albanians worked in Yugoslav development projects in Damascus, Cairo, and Baghdad. On a break from her studies in 1977, Melika visited her brother Yaqub in Iraq's capital, Baghdad. Yaqub like hundreds of Yugoslavs, was in the Middle East to service Yugoslavia's non-aligned ambitions. By then, Melika's excitement about the non-aligned movement had given way to disillusionment. She came to think of it as another Eurocentric approach to decolonization. As Yugoslavia grew in prominence in the non-aligned world, Muslims in Yugoslavia saw their country's international self-position as hypocritical, given the discriminatory conditions of Muslims within the country itself. Muslims were not recognized as a constitutive people of Yugoslavia until the constitutional reforms of 1971. Practicing Muslims were still kept away from decision-making positions in favor of secular Muslims, who were frequently rewarded for implementing emancipatory projects on their own communities. The later were known as good Muslims. Melika resisted what she saw as the incorporation of Islam in the service of Yugoslavia's foreign affairs, at the expense of continued othering of Muslims at home. The journey to Imam Hussein's shrine in Karbala radically changed her life. Resolved to embrace the wholeness of Islamic life, she returned to Yugoslavia wearing the chador, officially banned since the 1950s. In late September 1980, Melika attended a meeting of the communist writers in Belgrade, wearing a chador. Her colleagues thought it was a performance piece. The Yugoslav postmodern hub of the early 80s, at the peak of its artistic and intellectual creation, lacked the vocabulary for political acts. Unlike Belgrade, Zagreb, and Ljubljana, the centers of intellectual production, whose points of reference were Berlin, Paris, or London, Sarajevo produced a different kind of publics for Yugoslav consumption. In Sarajevo, hippies were discovering Muslim urban slang and music. Calling themselves neo-primitivists, they merged their interest in Western New Age spirituality with Yugoslavia's own stereotypes of lazy Muslim peasants who moved into the city and refused to integrate. The bizarre fusion seeped into movies, TV shows, music, and jokes. It went mainstream, providing relief to the Yugoslav upper middle classes from the economic crisis that was just beginning. In 1982, Melika sold everything she owned and bought a one-way ticket to Iran for herself and Amir. Amir adapted quickly to his new surroundings in Teheran, becoming popular among his peers as he quickly picked up Persian. He appeared on Iranian TV, reciting surahs by heart. The violence of the post-revolutionary Iran proved disastrous for his mother. Refused asylum by the Iranian government, betrayed, they returned to Yugoslavia. After turning in her Communist League membership card, Melika was fired from her job at the Cultural Educational Association of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Her literary work banned, she was shunned from any participation in public life. Following her release from prison in 1988, Melika moved back to Iran. Betrayed by the Islamist decolonial utopia she and her comrades had dreamt of, she became an iterant exile. No single place could hold her. In the 1990s, she traveled throughout the Middle East, soliciting support and solidarity to confront the ongoing genocides of Muslims in Bosnia. Returning to Sarajevo during the siege, in the face of the murder of her brother, friends and relatives, her worst fears had become a living nightmare. The last genocide on our people, she argues, cannot be understood outside the sustained and structural dehumanizations of Muslims in Yugoslavia. The post-war fragmentation of Bosnia in her eyes is not an exception to this designation of Muslims in the Balkans as a disposable and destabilizing presence that must be destroyed, but an organized cultivation of Europe as a white, Christian secular vitality, sustained through the death-making of all others that can only exist as temporary guests or future ghosts. Yugo-nostalgia, like European amnesia, refuses accountability for its contingent crimes, lest they are remembered as isolated and transient acts of accidental madness. They call it progress.
Ovdje što piše, znači, to su riječi hadisi kuci, odnosno riječi Allaha Đelešanhu koji nisu ušli u Kur'an i koji znače isprazni jednu kuću za me, ja sam s onima slomljenoga srca. To znači da čovjek kad želi da postigne ljubav i blizinu apsoluta treba da isprazni svoju kuću, svoje srce od svih drugih idola.
Sabatai Zevi was a diva. An Ottoman Sephardic rabbi from Smyrna, in 1648, Zevi declared himself a messiah. The rabbinical courts of the city found his chutzpah overbearing and declared him an impostor, a move that seems to have increased his popularity. Chased out of Smyrna, Zevi chose Salonika, the Ottoman center of Kabbalism at that time, staging elaborate ceremonies in celebration of his arrival. The news of Zevi's masquerade reached the Sublime Gates. Ahmed Kupurlu, Mehmed IV's shrewd vizier, imprisoned Zevi, asking him to either accept Islam or face trial. Upon choosing Islam, Mehmed IV appointed Zevi the keeper of the gates. Those followers that accepted Islam along with him came to be known as dönme, or converts. In Turkish, dönme means to turn, but it is also a term used for transgender people. To turn is a method, a moment of reflection, a means to unsettle, unlearn, and unmap disciplined histories. It also means to raid the records of nationalist mythologies and capitalist cartographies. This is not a documentary about neoliberal urban geographies. It is the other and other side of Salonika's story. The May 1936 workers' uprisings in Salonika shook Greece. It came to be known as the Bloody May Revolt. The lament of Tassos Tous's mother, hovering over her son's lifeless body, left an indelible mark on the 27-year-old Greek poet Yannis Ritsos. Retracing the anger and despair of Salonika in his poem, written 2 days after the uprising, Ritsos foresaw the impoverished provincial future of a city once destined for revolution. His eulogy, O Epitaphios, gave voice to the pain of degradation and death that followed Metaxas' use of the uprising to install a fascist dictatorship in the name of the monarchy and its military. It became the first of modern Greek poetry book to be burned in public. Like the tobacco workers of Salonika, who started the revolt, their memory and mourning was destined to disappear in the reactionary narration of the city, foreclosed under layers of coloniality. On the 70th anniversary of the Bloody May uprising in 2006, at a local squad in Salonika, the last survivor of the revolt, Yannis Tamtakos, retraced his memories of the murder of Tutsis by the police in front of Salonika's Metropolis hotel. The squad Fabrika Arfanet, a former Ottoman textile factory, fell silent, reflecting on the old and new assaults on the city, from the Metaxas dictatorship to the austerity politics of becoming European. Ruins, argues Anne Stoller, can become epicenters of renewed collective claims, as history in a spirited voice, as sites that animate both despair and new possibilities, bids for entitlement, and unexpected collaborative political projects. On Crispo Street, number 7, near the old Kulu Cafe quarter in Anopoli, another squad, Villa Varvara, a former Ottoman school, was served a city ordinance to evict the space. Purchased by the organization Thessaloniki Cultural Capital of Europe 1997, the building was now destined to become a cultural center. Preparing the city for European cultural capital, Roma and Albanian migrant families were thrown out through program-like raids without city ordinances. The gentrification of derelict Ottoman buildings and neighborhoods as national monuments, undertaken as a testimony to the city's newfound appreciation for multicultural pasts, sought to conceal the city's 1990s alliance with fascism. From volunteers from Salonika participating in the Srebrenica genocide, to left and right uniting to sing under Vasilis Papakonstantinou, shouting, "We will make shoes out of Albanian skin," as Milosevic was cleansing Kosovo, while Salonika gave a warm welcome to the war criminal Biljana Plavšić. The abandoned toilet paper factory outside Salonika, now turned refugee camp Saftex, is home to 2,000 Middle Eastern refugees. Muslim migrants pray in a makeshift tent, while the Greek army holds guard outside. Meanwhile, a few miles away, in the Ottoman mosque Yeni Chami, turned exhibition space, the Greek contemporary artist Lydia Dambasina's installation Gini Coefficient features an embalmed head of a large deer, spewing a piece of paper that reads, "The 62 richest people in the world own the same wealth as half of humanity, that is 3.5 billion people." In a continuously shifting paradigm, the city's modernity must be made European. In most Greek accounts of modernity arriving in Salonika, the fire of 1917 is considered a major turning point. The architect Ernest Ebrard, famous for designing French colonial architecture in the Maghreb and Southeast Asia, was tasked with rebuilding the city that had just been integrated into the Greek nation-state. The fire served as an opportunity to make Salonika Greek. Ebrard drew up plans for Aristotle Square, then known as Alexander the Great Square, invoking not ancient Greece, as was the case with Athens, but establishing a link between ancient Macedonia and Byzantium. The post-Ottoman imagination and production of Salonika and the French and European colonial encounter finally found its way back to Greece. Like most post-Ottoman nation-states, including Kemalist Turkey, the erasure of Ottoman modernity in Greece served to project the Ottomans as an obstacle to development. One can never become modern. The Salonika Ottoman bourgeoisie encircled the mahallas with cafes and storefronts, building for itself an Alafranga neighborhood to the east of the former city walls. Wishing to be elsewhere, the new neighborhood allowed them escape from both the recent peasant past as well as from the embarrassing ailing empire that could no longer keep up. The fetishization of those early Ottoman sites today as traces of the splendor of pre-modern Ottoman Salonika illuminates the absurdity of capitalist claims on a condensed and disciplined past in which the Young Turk Revolution of 1908, the population exchange of 1923, the revolt of 1936, and the deportation of the Jewish population between March and August 1943 never happened. The night they killed Lambrakis, I was returning from a date. "What's happened?" someone on the bus asked. No one knew. We saw policemen, but could make out nothing more. Narrating the assassination of the anti-war activist Grigoris Lambrakis by far-right extremists in 1963 in Salonika, Dino Christianopoulos joins novelist Vasilis Vasilikos and filmmaker Kostas Gavaras, documenting not only the life and death of Lambrakis, but giving voice to the growing protests against the conditions that led to his assassination. Both the novel and the movie Z, He Lives in Greek, rekindle the spirits of leftist movements which had been under attack by the military dictatorship, bringing to salience other bodies that bear the marks of violence and oppression. Christianopoulos generated a new language. He would attend to the homosexual, lesbian, and transgender bodies that his friend, trans-anarchist Paola Ravignotti, would later immortalize in her fanzine Craximo in the early 80s, the printing of which she had paid with blowjobs. Appropriating the structure and vocabulary of Greek Orthodox liturgy, by the 1960s widely dismissed as an instrument of state repression, his poems merge the religious with the erotic to make space for vernacular histories. Claiming kinship with his stylistic master, the Greek-Egyptian poet C.P. Cavafy, who, like himself, was also homosexual, Christianopoulos' poems borrow Cavafy's confessional technique to summon saints and lovers, exposing weaknesses in the lives of the saints, on which he mirrors the struggles faced by queer subjects of his generation. Cavafy was a Greek migrant from Egypt. Like the migrants of the population exchange, he embodied a sense of estrangement from the nation, in which displaced migrants become the settler oppressors who refuse the politics of the motherland once they have come to know her intimately and violently. As displaced queer subjects, both Cavafy and Christianopoulos questioned the dominant hetero-organization of time and space, seeking queer traces in a city that actively hid their ancestral songs and signs. Christianopoulos unearthed the memory of Rosa Ashkenazi, who by then had fallen into oblivion from westernized Greek mainstream culture. Born in Istanbul in the last decade of the 19th century, Ashkenazi grew up and came to fame in Salonika, later becoming one of the dearest performers of rebetiko among the displaced migrants from Asia Minor. Performing for Greek, Turkish, Jewish, and Albanian diaspora, and recording in Cold War Istanbul, among others with the Albanian Aiden Leskoviku, Ashkenazi was the last living embodiment of late Ottoman modernity. As Christian migrants from Asia Minor brought their melancholic longing for places left behind, Muslims, Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, and later Bulgarian, Macedonian, and Slavic-speaking populations deported around Eastern Europe, kept Salonika in their imaginations as their home that never really was, a fallen utopia, a nostalgic love that, as Svetlana Boym remarks, can only survive in a long-distance relationship. In 2014, in several prisons around Greece, inmates refused to return to the cells after their walking break. They stayed outside for 1 hour, protesting the violent death of Ilir Kareli, an Albanian migrant who was beaten to death by the Salonika police while in custody. New migrants from former socialist states, and more recently from the Middle East, would replace the marker of the internal other. Neoliberal restructuring of urban space replaces class with notions of culture, further racializing urban hierarchies, in which the Albanian migrant is integrated with the arrival of the Syrian one. My words are homeless, writes a Chechen migrant poet Jazra Khalid. They sleep on the benches of Kleftmono Square, covered in IKEA cartons. My words do not speak on the news. They're out hustling every night. My words are proletarian, slaves like me. They work in sweatshops night and day. Salonika is not a city of ghosts, though you may come across their shadows. If you look close enough, on Platea Eleftherias, on the corner of Leoforos Nikis Avenue and Eleftherios Venizelos Street, A small statue in the corner of a parking lot could not possibly tell a story of this once Jewish city, too small and sidestepped to mark the immense loss and erasure of Jewish memory. You will neither catch a glimpse of Bektashi traces near the Musa Baba tomb in Terpsithea Square in Anopoli, nor will you hear the azan from the Hamza Bey Mosque on Via Egnatia. You will find them in much better company, perhaps where they would prefer to be remembered, in the conversations of the still remaining squads of Salonika's marginal, migrant, queer, anti-fascist, and youth collectives, recounting the lost memory or ongoing misery as a way of maintaining and passing on the truth of the city that the nation wants them to forget.